of the Faith in the City series at Knollwood Baptist Church. Since the fall of 2018, we've been convening monthly community conversations, and so far around one core topic, educational equity. So we've typically been meeting once a month in the fall and the spring. My name's Diane Lipset, and I'm a member of the planning team, together with Dean Clifford and Spence O'Neill and Sylvia Oberly. So a few simple logistics, if you will. Please stay muted during the presentation to help our audio quality. You are welcome to use the chat to express questions and comments as they occur to you. It's fine to type them in as they come to mind. We'll wait for the question period at the end to raise and address as many of them as possible. You'll also see in the chat links for the Faith in the City Facebook page and our email address. So let us know if you'd like to receive regular notifications of programs. And at the end of our session, one of the members of our planning team, Spence O'Neill, will say a word about a supply drive to support our city's remote learning centers. In this most unusual year, the Faith in the City series has focused particularly on what we may be learning now to help us create a more just and equitable educational system. Today, we welcome a speaker with deep expertise and long experience on just that question. By any measure, Dr. Anthony Graham is one of our city and state's distinguished educational leaders. Currently the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Winston-Salem State University, Dr. Graham previously served as a professor and dean in the School of Education, and before his work in higher ed, he was a high school English teacher. His scholarly expertise is in multicultural education with a specific focus on the academic experiences of African-American male students, how their identities are formed, how their academic and ethnic identities are formed by and in educational environments. In December 2019, Governor Roy Cooper tapped Dr. Graham to chair a statewide task force with 34 members on developing a representative and inclusive vision for education. The acronym is DRIVE. They were charged in part with addressing the widening gap between the percentage of students of color in our state schools and the diversity of the educator workforce. A year later, that task force completed its work, and we are privileged indeed to have Provost Graham with us to share key findings and core challenges. Dr. Anthony Graham, welcome.
Thank you and good afternoon. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the invitation to join you this afternoon to talk to you about the work of the DRIVE Task Force. And I hope that you all will engage me in a conversation this afternoon. I don't want this to be me talking at you or to you, but talking with you in a very conversational, communal way. Now, having said that, I'm going to PowerPoint you. So I apologize for doing so, but I am putting up on the screen now the PowerPoint for this conversation. The most important thing on this slide is my contact information. I always begin here because I do believe in engaging in discussion long after a presentation. So by all means, please feel free to reach out to me either by email or by phone. Email is preferred because it comes directly to my phone, and usually I'm in meetings all day, so I can respond to you via email while I'm sitting in a meeting. But please, by all means, feel free to follow up with me so that we can continue the conversation, so that we can strategize and commiserate, if you will, to think more about this issue or other issues in our K-12 educational sector or even in higher education. So I welcome those conversations. So for the sake of time, I know I don't have a lot of time with you this afternoon, I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about teacher diversity in the state of North Carolina, and by de facto, talking about it in the United States of America as well. Then I want to give you about a 10-minute overview of the Drive Task Force, helping you to better understand the context for why Governor Cooper formed this particular task force and what we were asked to do. And then I'll spend about 15 minutes talking about the recommendations at a broad level, but then I'm going to do a deep dive into two or three of those recommendations, just so you can get a sense for what the task force recommended to the governor if you have not had an opportunity to read the report as of yet. So that's the plan for the afternoon, and I'm going to move forward at this point. As a professionally prepared classroom teacher, we always say that you don't do assumptive teaching. You make the assumption that people don't know. So you start with making certain that everyone has the same frame of reference, which then means that you can have that as a referral point moving forward in the conversation. So I want to make certain that we understand the issue of diversity in our K-12 schools in the state of North Carolina. So when we look at our teacher demography and our student demography in our K-12 schools, what we see is that there's an incongruence, and it boils down to an issue of representation along the racial and ethnic lines. So when we look at our teacher workforce, 80% essentially of our K-12 classroom teachers is white. When we look at our student demography of our K-12 classrooms, we see that we have over 50%, 53% of those students are of color, Black and brown. So there is an incongruence in terms of representation. In the educational research, that is a cause for concern, potentially, because you begin to have questions about things relative to socio-political and socio-cultural incongruences that may emerge in a classroom setting. You begin to have questions about the cultural competence of the classroom teachers. Do they know the audience whom they're teaching and serving? Are they spending time immersing themselves in the lives of their students so that they can better situate the content that they're teaching in the lived experiences of the students whom they serve? So these types of things point to concerns for those reasons. It's not to say that because you have this type of incongruence that there's automatically going to be some learning challenges, but it raises the question and makes us think a little bit differently about what happened. So this is the diversity of our K-12 schools in the state of North Carolina as of 2018. Unfortunately, the state of North Carolina is not unique. The percentage of teachers across the United States of America who are white is 81%. So we are very on par with what we see nationally. As I tell people when I do these presentations, unfortunately, when you're thinking about racial and ethnic diversity in our K-12 schools from the teacher perspective, help is not on the way. According to our 2018 data on our educator preparation pathways, when we look at our 4-year traditional teacher preparation pathway at our undergraduate institutions, 81% of the students enrolled in our educator preparation programs in 2018 was white. When we look at our alternative pathway, so this would be the pathway where individuals who have bachelor's degree at a minimum in hand, they may not have majored in education as an undergraduate, could have been a math major, a history major, an English major, and they've decided after graduation that they now want to pursue a career in the teaching space. They enter an alternative pathway. Well, 55% of those individuals is white, 45% of color. So while it's a more diverse pathway than the traditional 4-year pathway, it is still predominantly white. So from a racial ethnic perspective, help is not on the way. This is somewhat concerning because what we have learned over the last 20 years, and really over the last decade, we've learned a great deal more about the impact that our teachers of color have on our K-12 students. In the early 2000s, the late 90s, early 2000s, the research essentially said that teachers of color had a direct impact on students of color. And generally, that impact was with respect to their behaviors in the classroom, maybe even their aspirations post high school. What we now know within the last decade is our teachers of color are actually having a positive impact on all K-12 learners, and not just on behavioral or social aspects, but on their learning, particularly in reading and mathematics. So research shows us that teachers of color have significant, profound impact on the reading and math scores of all students, not just students of color. When we begin to delve into the research a little bit more to figure out why might this be the case, what we're finding is that teachers of color are more likely to use what we call culturally relevant practices or culturally relevant pedagogy in the classroom, which affirms student identities. Geneva Gay talks about culturally relevant pedagogy as the pedagogy of the oppressed, if you will, thinking about teaching in a way that differs from what we normally do in status quo in a classroom. So you're teaching from the fringes almost. You're thinking about those students who are oftentimes disenfranchised, marginalized, and forgotten about. So you're teaching to those students as opposed to teaching to the student in the middle, the normal student, if you will. And you're doing so using three criteria. You're thinking about academic excellence, meaning you want to make certain that if you're teaching reading, you're emphasizing reading skills. If you're teaching math, you're emphasizing math excellence. So academic excellence is at the core of this. But the second criterion is cultural competence. You're spending time getting to know your audience, understanding their lived experiences on a daily basis, what they see, what they encounter, and then you're situating your content in their lived experiences. So you're being culturally competent. And then finally, the third criterion, and perhaps the most important one, is what she calls critical consciousness. So now that you've learned this material, how do you take what you've learned and leverage it so that you can improve your community and your society around you? So it answers that age old question, why am I learning this anyway? Well, for many students, particularly students of color, being able to take what you've learned and return it to the community to help uplift your community answers that question, and it gives it relevance, it gives it significance. So our teachers of color are more likely to use this type of approach in their classrooms, which then would make the learning relevant, meaningful, and significant. We also see that our teachers of color, particularly when it comes to Black students, are more likely to express interest in college, and they're less likely to drop out of school when they've been taught by at least one Black teacher. So this is the impact of our teachers of color that we're learning a great deal more about in our educational research almost on a daily basis. Here's the concern, however. There is an exodus of our teachers of color. We see that our teachers of color are leaving the K-12 classroom at an alarmingly high rate, particularly our Black males. Our teachers of color are 24% more likely to leave the classroom than their white counterparts. And when we begin to ask the question, why are you leaving the classroom? What we tend to hear is a constant refrain, I feel devalued in this space. I feel silenced in this space. I'm always questioned pedagogically. Because please understand that teaching in a culturally relevant way goes against the grain of what you normally see in a classroom. So I'm questioned, my decisions are questioned, and I'm questioned professionally. And oftentimes I don't feel supported professionally. So these are reasons that kind of factor into why we're seeing so many of our teachers of color leave the classroom almost as quickly as they enter the classroom. But I also like to point out to people that there's a historical underpinning to this as well. This isn't a recent activity. We've seen, unfortunately, our teachers of color forced out of the classroom dating back to school integration. Before the Civil Rights Act, based on survey data, most Southern Blacks, when surveyed, indicated that they were classroom teachers. Before 1954, nearly 50% of Blacks living in the South listed teaching as a profession. Unfortunately, after integration, we saw a rapid, precipitous decline in the presence of Black teachers between 1964 and 1972, a decline of 32%. It's estimated that almost 40,000 Black teachers in the South were fired. They were forced out of the profession. Now, this is where I tell people the truth, and oftentimes people don't like my truth, but I'm going to tell my truth. In this space of integration, unfortunately, we had far too many white families who feared Black people teaching their children. So for that reason, Black teachers were forced out of the profession. And then to ensure that they weren't able to come back into the profession, things like IQ testing were put into place. So in order to become a classroom teacher, you had to pass an IQ test. And if you didn't pass that IQ test, then you couldn't become a classroom teacher. I'm going to come back to that later in this presentation because that same practice in the 1960s still exists today in 2021. The final thing I'll say on this slide is that our Black teachers, the presence of our Black teachers have declined steadily over that time period, 8.1% in 1971, in 2018, 6.7%. So this is what we call the white streaming effect in K-12 schools, an intentionality to ensure that whiteness is the prevailing uh, thought, philosophy, and ideology of our K-12 schools. So having shared all that, let me talk to you very quickly about the Drive Task Force and why Governor Cooper put this particular group together. The task force was commissioned in 2019 on December the 9th by Executive Order number 113. There were initially 15 members of the task force, and then it blossomed to 34 members. And our job continues to be, to advise the governor on strategies that would address matters of equity and inclusion within the state of North Carolina in our K-12 schools. Our membership is very diverse. You will see on the screen before you some of the names of the individuals who are serving on the task force. You will see that there are individuals from our K-12 schools, classroom teachers, as well as principals. You will see that there are members from our public and private institutions of higher education. You will see that there's representation from our Department of Health and Human Services. You will see that there are individuals from the corporate and business sector. You will see that there are policymakers, individuals like Zach Hawkins, who's a representative, or Jay Wendell Hall. So we have a very large group that is very diverse in its representation, ensuring that we hear from various sectors and perspectives across the state of North Carolina, all with the sole intent of advising the governor on these issues of equity and inclusion, but specifically focused on how we go about diversifying the teacher workforce. What we were asked to do when we came together was to submit a plan to the governor by January 1 of this year that would accomplish 5 things. Number one, the governor wanted us to assess the state's progress toward increasing K-12 public school educator diversity. Number two, he asked us to identify short-term, midterm, and long-term strategies that would increase educator diversity. Number three, he asked us to think about assets and resources that we could leverage within the state of North Carolina and beyond in recruiting, retaining, supporting our educators of color. Number four, he asked us to propose metrics and standards to evaluate success in these aforementioned areas. And then he asked us to prioritize these things, to think about what this plan would look like over a 5 to 10-year window and what would be phase one of priority, phase two of priority, and phase three of priority. So we put our work together really thinking about these different areas of the continuum, understanding that we have to think about the recruitment of students of color into our teacher education programs at the undergraduate level, but we also have to think about the recruitment of people of color into the K-12 classroom space. So we thought about recruitment in those two pathways. We thought about the preparation process. How do we go about preparing individuals, particularly our candidates of color, whether it's through the traditional pathway or the alternative pathway, but how do we prepare them to really be that culturally relevant educator who's thinking about academic excellence, who's thinking about cultural competence, who's thinking about critical consciousness. And then once we've hired these individuals into our K-12 classrooms, how are we supporting them? How do we make certain that they don't say downrange that I feel devalued, I feel silenced, I feel questioned professionally and pedagogically, and retain these individuals within the profession? So given that context, the Drive Task Force, we did our work over a 7-month period. all virtual. I've never met some of the Drive Task Force members. I've never met them in person. A lot of this work has been done virtually. All this work has been done virtually. But we offered 10 recommendations to the governor. And these recommendations are organized in this way. There are 3 recommendations that focus specifically on recruitment. How do we go about thinking explicitly about recruiting students of color into educator preparation programs and then people of color into the K-12 classrooms? There are 3 recommendations focused specifically on preparation. How do we ensure that we're preparing these candidates, whether it's through a traditional alternative pathway, thinking about that culturally relevant pedagogy at the forefront of mind, but also thinking about other candidates as well, not just candidates of color, but all candidates. Because the reality of the situation is if 81% of our candidates in our educator preparation programs are white, then it's going to take some time to diversify the profession. So we have to give some attention to the individuals who are currently teaching, making certain that they are understanding and using culturally relevant, culturally sustaining practices. So we have to make certain that this becomes a calling card for all of our educator preparation programs, irrespective of whether it's an HBCU, a historically Black college and university, or a majority institution. It has to be a fixture for all of our programs. And then finally, 3 recommendations focus on support and retention. How do we make certain that we are supporting and retaining our K-12 classroom teachers of color? And then there's one global recommendation, essentially a recommendation that says to the governor, we believe that there needs to be a third-party objective body that ensures that this action plan is executed with fidelity, regularly assessed, continually improved, making certain that we don't deviate from the path that we've articulated. We didn't want to leave this to the State Board of Education, and Chair Davis has argued with me that he believes this is the work of the State Board of Education. And while I agree theoretically, I do believe that there needs to be a third party objective body helping to ensure that this work is executed. And then there are a total of 46 short-term, midterm, and long-term strategies. These strategies essentially align with these broader recommendations, making certain that they are being propped up, if you will, so that they're executed in a very effective way. So what I want to do over the next few minutes here is kind of do a deep dive. I'm going to take a look at one recruitment strategy. We'll take a look at one preparation recommendation, and then we'll take a look at one support and retention recommendation, just so you get a feel for what the task force not only recommended, but what we were thinking. So recommendation number 1, which is a recruitment focused recommendation, is as follows: offer affordable post-secondary access through scholarships, loan forgiveness, and tuition reimbursement programs to address the disproportionate financial burden incurred by aspiring educators of color. And you will see that we identify in our recommendation the stakeholders who are responsible for not only chewing on this recommendation, but then executing an action plan to make it happen. We wanted to point out the stakeholders because we need you and people across the state of North Carolina to advocate with these responsible stakeholders so that we can push the envelope on doing some things differently. Having said that, the reason for this recommendation really is about looking at the disproportionate financial burden that we see, not only for educators of color, but for students of color in general in higher education. Our students of color are more likely to take out significant more loans in order to attain their bachelor's degrees. And when you begin to look at those students who are in our educator preparation programs, the same holds true. So we know if these students are taking out more loans, then we need to try to find more financial assistance packages, if you will, that would allow these students to consider this pathway and then pursue the pathway. Unfortunately, we're finding too many of our students of color at our four-year institutions who stay away from the teaching profession because of things relative to finances. So this is a way for us to give some consideration of how we ease this financial burden, this financial barrier, so that we get more students of color pursuing this opportunity. So thinking about scholarships, Thinking about the Teaching Fellows Program as an example. If you're not familiar with the Teaching Fellows Program, it is essentially a program that pays for tuition every year that a student is enrolled in a educator preparation program. And the commitment for the student is to return to teach in a K-12 classroom for at least 4 years, returning that service for the scholarship that they've received. Unfortunately, the Teaching Fellows Program does not currently exist on the campus of a historically Black college or university. Um, Unfortunately, more than 80% of our teaching fellows, the students who are currently enrolled in the program, are white. So it is a program that provides financial assistance, but in many ways, it's at present perpetuating the very issues that we've had in the teaching profession all along. So not only do we need to advocate for the presence of the Teaching Fellows Program on more of our campuses of our HBCUs, but we also need to question what's going on with the program inherently, that it's perpetuating the very profile that we see and have seen in our K-12 teacher workforce. So, and the last thing I'll say before I move forward, loan forgiveness programs. So if students have to take out loans to earn their degrees, can there be and should there be some process that's seamless, not convoluted and confusing, uh, as is often the case, so that individuals can pursue loan forgiveness opportunities after they've taught for a certain number of years, or perhaps in certain districts and things of that nature. So that's a recommendation from the task force, so you can get a sense for what we were thinking and kind of the calculus in what we were thinking. Let me share with you very quickly task force recommendation number 6, which is a preparation focused recommendation. This recommendation reads, and I won't read the entire thing, just what's in bold: revise the North Carolina professional teaching standards to directly incorporate anti-racist, anti-bias, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, and require educator preparation programs to report how they incorporate these proficiencies across their course offerings and programming. Let me kind of share with you why this recommendation is in our report. First, the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standard sets the expectation for what a classroom teacher should know and how a classroom teacher should perform in our K-12 schools, which then means that our educator preparation programs have to follow these standards because we're preparing our candidates for employment in the K-12 schools. So the standards are what we have to ensure we're paying attention to if we want programs to move in a certain direction. Here's the issue. The present North Carolina professional teaching standards, which were constructed back in 2008, have not been revisited and revised since their implementation. It's been 13 years ago. A lot has changed in 13 years. The other thing is what we're finding, particularly with some of our institutions that are what we call majority or predominantly white institutions. Unfortunately, when you begin to look at issues relative to diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we'll find is that there is a class, one class, focused on those issues. The rest of the program pays little attention to these issues. In order for our programs to think differently about anti-racist language, anti-bias, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, the standards have to be changed so now that the programs engage in wholesale change. So that's the thinking behind this particular recommendation. Number one, we believe that ethically and morally it's the right thing to do. You should always be responsive to the audience whom you serve. If 53% of our students are of color, then we need to pay more attention to their experience and center them in the way we go about teaching. So ethically and morally, it's the right thing to do. And secondly, we know just from a logistics systemic standpoint, if we're to get educator preparation programs to truly begin to value and not only acknowledge, but value and execute issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then we have to pay attention to the teaching standards. So that's recommendation number 6, the preparation focus standard. And finally, I will share with you recommendation number 8, the support and retention focus standard, which reads, and I'm gonna read this entire standard or recommendation, excuse me: develop and sustain pathways for advancement that are tailored to the needs of educators of color. including providing financial and logistical support for obtaining national board certification, expanding career ladders to keep effective career educators of color in the classroom, encouraging educators of color to teach honors level, advanced placement, or international baccalaureate courses, and establishing dedicated pipelines for educators of color to become administrators. I wanted to read this entire one because there's a lot here, and I want to unpack a lot of it as much as I can. Number one, if we know that many of our educators of color are leaving the classroom, and oftentimes they point to salary as an issue, one of the ways that we can ensure that we are increasing teachers' salary, and this is just across the board, is supporting them and encouraging them to obtain their national board certification. There's a 12% pay increase that comes with the attainment of national board certification. The state of North Carolina has long been one of the nation's gems when it comes to teachers possessing national board certification. We lead the way. We have more nationally board certified teachers in the state of North Carolina than any other state in the nation, and it's been that way for quite some time. Here's what a lot of people don't know: 93% of our nationally board certified teachers is white. 93%, 9-3. So we've got an audience taking full advantage of this opportunity, but for whatever reason, another audience isn't taking advantage of it. And the question becomes why? What can we do to ensure that more of our teachers of color take advantage of this national board certification opportunity? The other thing that we have to pay attention to, the state of North Carolina used to pay for our teachers to pursue national board certification. Now it's a loan, it's $2,000. So we have to rethink, is that the right approach to take? So I want to put that in front of you as something to consider. Additionally, we have to make certain that we're paying attention to career ladders. Right now, if I'm a K-12 classroom teacher, if I wanted to earn extra money, that would be significant. I'm not talking about, being an athletic director where I might get a $1,500 bump or a coach or something of that nature, but where I'm actually earning some percent increase to my base salary. The best way for me to do so is to become an administrator. But what we know is not all of our classroom teachers want to go into administration. So they find themselves teaching, but not being able to earn additional compensation because they don't want to go into administration, but they love what they do in the classroom. So now we have to challenge ourselves as a state to think about, how do we create career ladders so that we encourage our classroom teachers who truly love being in the classroom working with young people, but may want to assume additional responsibility in the school. Maybe I serve as a mentor. Maybe I do professional development. Maybe I do some things at the district level while I'm helping with curriculum writing and so on and so forth. How do we ensure that those individuals are earning additional compensation while remaining in the classroom and not leaving the classroom to become an administrator if that's not where the interest lies? We're using a very archaic salary structure that we should have gotten rid of 2 decades ago. The time is now. We have to think differently about career ladders for all of our teachers, but particularly our teachers of color. And then we have to encourage our educators of color to teach honors level classes, advanced placement, international baccalaureate. Oftentimes, these classes are not presented as opportunities for our educators of color. In many ways, our educators of color, it's kind of what I call the blessing and the curse. Oftentimes, our educators of color have this ability to connect with students who are struggling learners. And because they do it so well, they get pigeonholed teaching struggling learners. I can speak to my own experience. When I was hired as a high school English teacher, the principal who hired me during the interview said to me, and I hate to use this language, but this is what she said: I'm going to give you the bottom of the barrel students. And I worked hard to move those students. They succeeded. They learned at an optimal level. And my reward the following year from the principal was, you did a great job connecting with those students. I'm going to give you the same type of students next year. It burned me out. It burned me out. It would have been nice to have had some diversity in my teaching schedule. Unfortunately, that was not afforded to me. We find this oftentimes with our educators of color. The blessing that they have, the ability to connect with students who might be on the fringes, marginalized, disenfranchised, also becomes the curse because that's where they get pigeonholed. We have to think differently about how we support our educators of color and afford them the opportunity to engage students, oftentimes white students, who normally wouldn't be engaged by an educator of color in these higher distinction classes. So those are some components of the support and retention focused recommendation. So I will end here. If I had some strategic ask of you today, there are a couple of things I would ask you to do. They're advocacy points. Advocacy point number one, I would ask you to advocate for the expansion of our teaching fellow program at our HBCUs. But I was also asked that you advocate that we expand the teaching fellows program in terms of discipline. Right now, the teaching fellows program only focuses on special education and STEM, but we need diverse teachers across all disciplines. So being myopically focused on STEM and special education, while without question there's a need for those disciplines, there's a need for quality teachers of color in all disciplines. So we need to think more broadly about the Teaching Fellows program and the disciplines that it's serving, as well as where the program is housed. We need to advocate for those scholarships so that we can compete against engineering and agriculture and business and these other disciplines on campus that offer scholarships to our classroom or to our undergraduate students. Right now, our educator preparation programs don't have the types of financial resources necessary to compete against those discipline areas. And if we can't do scholarships in an abundance, then loan forgiveness programs should be offered to these students who are pursuing a career in teaching. I would ask you to advocate for both, not an either or, but for both scholarships and loan forgiveness. I would ask that you advocate for a revision to our teacher compensation scale and that we insert our career ladders in what we're doing. And then finally, I would ask that you advocate for an update and a revision to the North Carolina professional teaching standards, but making certain that we're paying attention to the language of anti-racism, anti-bias, and culturally relevant pedagogy within those standards. If we update the standards and we don't pay particular attention to anti-racism, anti-bias, and culturally relevant pedagogy, then from our vantage point, we've missed the mark. So that's a snapshot of the work that we've done. There's a great deal more, but I don't have enough time to kind of delve into everything that's there. But that gives you what I hope is a solid overview and working knowledge of what the task force is doing and has done. And I definitely encourage you, if you have not read the report, please do so. Um, and of course, I'm biased. It's one of the best reports I've ever read. And it's not because I had anything to do with it. It really is an eye-opening report. There are nuggets within the report that I think would challenge the way we think about preparing classroom teachers and what we do to retain and support classroom teachers. So I encourage you to read it. It's a simple read. It's not a very long report at all. So having said that, I am going to be quiet at this point, and I will open the floor and entertain any questions you might have if that is the will of the planning committee.
That is very much the will of the those of us who have the privilege of hosting you, Dr. Graham. So you will not be silent for long. Thank you for so rich and informative a presentation. The presentation has been recorded and will be available for those who want to watch again. Are your slides generally available, Dr.
Yes,
Graham?
I will send these to you.
Okay, so those also, we can post a link to the slides if you'd like to look back at particular aspects. And the drive report is readily available online as well. One of the members of our audience who asked a question as you were speaking was caught by that information that there are not programs for teacher fellows at HBCUs. And so it seemed helpful that you made that an advocacy point for us to focus on, because members of the audience were already focusing on that. Why? Can you say more about that lack?
It's a great question. So let me give you a very brief historical context. So the Teaching Fellows Program in North Carolina came into existence in 1986. By 2014, the General Assembly decided to phase out the Teaching Fellows Program. What many people don't know is that before the program was phased out, the Teaching Fellows Program was only at that point housed at two historically Black colleges and universities, North Carolina A&T and North Carolina Central University. The other HBCUs that had the Teaching Fellows Program unfortunately lost the program. Little known fact is North Carolina Central and North Carolina A&T were both in jeopardy of losing the program when the program was phased out. Now, why is that? There are a lot of, from my vantage point, procedural issues with the Teaching Fellows Program. So let me give you a snapshot of how this thing would work. As the Dean of the College of Education at North Carolina A&T, our job was to go out and recruit individuals who would be interested in coming into our educator preparation program through the Teaching Fellows route. So we would go out and recruit, let's say 200 candidates. Those candidates would then apply to North Carolina A&T, yes, but they would apply to the Teaching Fellows Program as well. The Teaching Fellows vetting process would then be carried out by an independent body. North Carolina A&T had nothing to do with it. And along the way, the 200 people whom we recruited would get whittled down to 50 people through that process. And then those 50 people would identify on their application their top 3 schools of interest. So I would put North Carolina A&T as my number 1, I would put UNC Charlotte as my number 2, and I would put North Carolina Central as my number 3. When the award was made to those 50 students, the award would often be, we are granting you the Teaching Fellows Program, but we need you to go to UNC Charlotte, because the entity overseeing the Teaching Fellows Program was trying to ensure racial diversity in the Teaching Fellows Program across the state with the universities that had it. So although we recruited 200 people and 50 might end up being in the pool, not all 50 who said A&T was my first choice would come to A&T. Of those 50, we might end up seeing 20. So I wanted to make sure you had that context. So the program phased out. The program comes back into existence in 2017, I think it was. There's a Teaching Fellows Commission that's responsible for reviewing the applications from our educator preparation programs. And essentially the rubric that's used or was used, they're updating it now, I believe, but the rubric that was used, unfortunately, focuses on a couple of metrics where we see, unfortunately, our educator preparation programs at our HBCUs not meeting those metrics. So I know in 2016, when the call for proposals was submitted, there were 16 institutions, 16 EPPs that submitted a proposal to ask for the Teaching Fellows Program. Only one HBCU submitted an application. It was my HBCU when I was the dean at North Carolina A&T. And unfortunately, we did not receive the program. The programs at that time, the initial wave went to UNC Chapel Hill, UNC Charlotte, Elon, Meredith, and I'm missing the 5th one, but no HBCUs were selected. No universities in rural areas were selected. East Carolina, Western Carolina. It's interesting that the areas where we say we need the most diversity and the most need is not where the program went. The final thing I'll say about Teaching Fellows, and then I'll be quiet because as you can tell, I have a bone to pick with Teaching Fellows. When I asked about the Teaching Fellows program and why from 1986 to 2014, you have the mechanism at your fingertips where you could have said, we're going to put in place an equity metric. And if nothing more, for 4 years or 5 years, we're going to hold constant where we're going to make certain that 50% of the recipients of the Teaching Fellows program are students of color. We could have addressed teacher diversity overnight had we put that metric in place, but we never did, and we still haven't done it. So when I asked the question, why don't we do something radically different with our Teaching Fellows program? The response that I was given from a very well-intended person who I respect, admire, and have worked alongside for a long time, she said, what we wanted to do first was pay attention to quality. And once we felt that quality was in place, Then we would pay attention to diversity. And my response to her was, so you're telling me that diversity and quality are somehow dichotomous, that they can't exist in one and the same? And she said, no, 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 Anthony, that's not what I meant. But that's what you said. And that's the way our program operates. So when we talk about what's the issue with teaching fellows inherently, that it perpetuates the 80% white demography, it's that mindset, it's that mentality, it's that, and people don't like to hear this, but I speak my truth, it's that systemic racism that leads to this type of issue. So it's not only about placing the program at HBCUs, that's a huge step, but we also have to ask the question, what are we doing within the program in the selection of the candidates who become teaching fellows to address this issue of teacher diversity?
Dr. Willett Nash asked whether you would use the term elitist and then said you answered that question. She also asked if advocacy for better compensation and attention to career ladders included advocating for restoring pay increases that had been taken away in recent years.
We didn't speak specifically, Dr. Nash, to restoring those pay increases. And quite honestly, that didn't come up during our analysis and our conversation. So that's something that we did not speak to specifically and explicitly in the report, unfortunately.
I'm going to try and summarize a lengthy question and invite Chuck Spong to jump in and clarify if I missed some things. But in a summary of his complex question, what can be done to sustain action on these recommendations so they are not vulnerable to being reduced or changed with a change in governor, for example? And as other parts of that question, he asks, is there growing support for these? Do you perceive growing support for these recommendations across state governing bodies, or do you perceive resistance at the state level?
A series of great questions. To the first question, that's why we put in place that 10th recommendation, where there should be this objective third party. So irrespective of who leadership is, we know governors are going to change. We know people in the General Assembly are going to change and so forth. But if you've got this third body, objective body that's really paying attention to this issue, then irrespective of the leaders who come and go, we can make certain that this action plan stays the course. So that's the impetus behind that recommendation. And just that quickly, I forgot the other question. What was the second one about?
Do you feel growing support or resistance in this moment?
So that's a great question, Chuck. It's a mixed bag. There's conceptually and theoretically, people agree with the premise. It's good to have a diverse teacher workforce. What people are disagreeing upon is, where do we invest the resources to get there? And getting caught in that space. So I've presented to not only the governor's education cabinet, but the state legislators, General Assembly, Department of Public Instruction, the State Board of Education. I've presented to all these folk. I continue to have ongoing meetings with the Office of State Budget and Management so that there are dollars being associated with elements of this task force report, really spurred on by the Leandro case. The Leandro report actually set us up nicely because it said, and now we're going to hand this off to the Drive Task Force, and whatever they recommend, there should be financial investments to support those recommendations. So it's a nice handoff, a good complementary piece. So it's been surprising to have conversations with the Office of State Budget and Management. With these types of task force, that's not something I've seen in the past. So I've been honored and humbled to have that type of access. So there is support for the report itself and for the recommendations, but there's some dissension in terms of how do we get there, which is why I want this third party objective body to help with the execution of the action plan so that we can make certain that we stay the course. I'll say this final thing and then I'll be quiet. because there is some dissenter, or there are some dissenters. I did a couple of radio interviews right before the Christmas holiday talking about the Drive Task Force report. And I always tell people, I'm going to tell you my truth, and whether you like it or not, that's up to you. But I'm going to tell you my truth. And unfortunately, a couple of those radio interviews had little to do with the Drive Task Force report and more to do with the assertion that we're focused on systemic racism and these things don't exist, so on and so forth. When I returned to this office on campus on January the 4th, I had 15 letters addressed to me, no return address on any of them. Half of them were death threats. Many of them were vile and just not what I anticipated. And understanding the context of the time, I get what was going on in the country and so forth, but never in my wildest dreams would you have ever convinced me that talking about diversifying the teacher workforce would lead people to say, I want you dead. How dare you go across this country, or across this state, and advocate for, and this is what one person wrote in the letter, advocate for the presence of more gorillas in our classroom. You could not have convinced me in 2021 that I would receive letters of that nature, but I did. So, but as I told someone, when you start rattling cages and people get scared, and you're in the right space. It's going to take a whole heck of a lot more to scare me away. I'm from Kinston, North Carolina. We ain't easily scared. So it's going to take more than letters. You got to do more than write. And if you really want me to go away, come talk to me, man to man, woman to man, whatever it might be. Let me see your face and hear your voice. Don't put your stuff in an anonymous letter.
That is incredibly heartbreaking.
It is.
And thank you for the vulnerability to share that. And it would be your call, but I think it'd be important for folks to know that that's the kind of resistance you're getting. And certainly you have to decide whether you want to go there emotionally. But I think we've begun to expect that, but to hear it in the context of just concrete database, research-based reports, I think it's important to the overall dialogue, but of course you'd have to decide how much to open up to that side of things.
I've shared it with the appropriate authorities and they're looking into it, but I don't expect anything to come of that. But I've taken the appropriate steps. But as I said to a group a couple of weeks ago, I'm here. Write 15 more letters. I'm not going away.
And I concur with and appreciate Chuck's response there. We value your courage and your candor. You shared it with the appropriate authorities, but you chose to share it with us. And our shock and disbelief is really important for us to be asked to bear witness to what that experience is for a leader such as yourself. In the
Ms. Lipset,
yes.
Before we leave this point, I want to capture some significance in that comment with a question for Dr. Graham. Because you see, these attitudes are generationally developed and acquired and passed down to children. So now that raises a different question for me in terms of educator preparation and the struggle to attract educators of color to the profession with all of the other barriers that we are challenged by as one who was involved in teacher preparation. How do we now prepare our teachers of color to face children who are going to bring same and similar attitudes into the classroom to make them ready and effective to counter some of this ideology? Because you talked about white students rarely have teachers of color. And at one time, perhaps they would have respected those teachers of color. But I question, with this ideology being so pervasive now, if that's going to be a problem we need to address in preparing our educators of color to go out into our schools.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Dr. Nash. And we speak to this somewhat in the report, but it's something that we really need to pay more attention to. And I would say this particularly to our K-12 schools. Are we creating space for our teachers of color to have these affinity groups where they're able to talk about these issues? Because I will tell you on a daily basis, probably multiple times a day, your teachers of color are experiencing racial microaggressions, not only from their students and their parents of the students, but their colleagues as well.
Yeah.
Someone simply asking a teacher of color, your hair, can I put my hand in your hair? How do you do that? That's a racial microaggression. People take offense to that. And it's hard for some people to wrap their minds around, but that's offensive to some folk. So if I hear that multiple times a day and I have no release,
Yeah.
I have no space where I can talk about these issues, I'm now bearing this on my shoulders and having to think about my teaching job and how to engage students in a context where I feel disrespected, devalued, and so forth.
Yeah.
Where's the opportunity for me to have these discussions? And I've been challenging individuals, to your point, Dr. Nash, in our educator preparation programs as well. You have to create the same space for our undergraduate students and those students in those alternative pathways as well, because they're going to experience those racial microaggressions as students in the classroom. The very literature that we choose and select to read in the classroom is a racial microaggression. So how are we paying attention to these things in a very intentional way and affording people spaces where they can release the burden and the pressure, the stress that has accumulated over time and will ultimately serve as a reason that I choose to exit the profession or perhaps choose not to go into the profession? These are critically important topics. So, Dr. Nash, I appreciate your point. It's something that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would even argue we need to think about it with our students as well, our K-12 students. I never forget, I was doing a workshop with a group. We had about 400 Black men on the campus, Black male students, K-12 Black male students, high school students at North Carolina A&T when I was the dean there. And I remember doing a presentation to the group, and there was a young man, he's a 12th grader who is living in Hampton Homes in Greensboro. He stood up and he said to me at the end of the program, Dr. Graham, thank you for allowing us this opportunity to talk about what we're going through. But how do I make sure that this sustains when I get back to my school next week? And how do I make sure that I have the same opportunity to talk about these issues with the Black boys in my school 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now? Our students have that same stress and pressure that they're facing and no release point. And then we question why they misbehave. They're stressed. They don't have a release point.
Yeah. And not to put any more work on your shoulders, Dr. Graham, because you've already got a lot. But the comment you just made also has some implications for school leader development.
Absolutely.
Because the kind of climate that you describe has got to be supported by principals and central office administrators, superintendents, and school boards. So, this I'm putting out to the whole group because you, Dr. Graham, cannot do this alone.
I'm going to ask that we consider the limitations of the clock to be a gift, to end with this kind of powerful set of questions and challenges and unresolved issues is perhaps a powerful place to end. So rather than inviting more questions, if you would like to use the chat to make an expression to Dr. Graham, that would be appropriate. And I'm going to invite, and I have some team members concurring with me, I'm going to invite my colleague on this planning team, Spence O'Neill, to use email to send you more information about the supply drive for the remote learning centers, so that the conclusion of our time together is this powerful set of concerns and questions that Dr. Nash has helped articulate and Dr. Graham has responded to so powerfully. So again, if you would care to use the comment to the chat section to express your appreciation to Dr. Graham. That's a great use of the chat. And both the PowerPoint and the recording of this session will be available shortly. Dr. Graham, thank you so much for your life's work, for this report and PowerPoint presentation, but for your courage and candor with us today. Thank you so much.